Gather round, lads, it's time for a tale. Hand me a book and a warm pint of ale. Let's discuss writing and the literary gods with Dan Roberts on the Dadlit Pod.
Welcome to the Dadlit Pod, the literary podcast for people who are wondering if they will have time to make their famous chili this weekend. Tonight I'm joined by Stephen Hartov. Stephen was born in New London, Connecticut. He earned a Bachelor's of Fine Arts from Boston University. In 1973, he joined the U.S. Merchant Marine and served with the Military Sealift Command, or MSC, beginning a series of adventures that would later appear in his nonfiction pieces and fictional works. In 1977, he volunteered for the Israeli Defense Forces Airborne Corps, serving first as a paratrooper and later in a special operations branch of Israeli military intelligence. He subsequently spent 13 years as a reservist in the IDF and later as a task force commander, rank of major in the New York National Guard. In the mid 1980s, he began writing espionage novels based in the Middle East. His trilogy, The Heart of Ramadan, The Nylon Hand of God, and The Devil's Shepherd, earned nominations for the National Book Award, top 10 placements in the Book of the Month Club, and translations in 6 foreign languages. In 2003, he co-authored the New York Times nonfiction bestsellers In the Company of Heroes, followed by Night Stalkers and Afghanistan on the Bounce. His newest novel, The Last of the Seven, is the second part of a thrilling World War II trilogy that began with The Soul of the Thief, also from Hanover Square Publishers. He is the former editor-in-chief of Special Operations Report, a professional journal on military and law enforcement special tactics. His works are recommended readings by the U.S. Army War College, and he is also a dad. Welcome to the Dadlet Pod, Stephen. By the way, I don't know if you can notice, but I have Israeli paratroopers on my mantle over there from the reclaiming of the Temple Mount.
Oh yeah, wow. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Dan. I appreciate it very much. No,
Yes,
I can't see them, but I know the scene very well.
yes. And believe it or not, when I was a curator at a military helmet museum in Arkansas, that actually happened, by the way. This is a real story. I got to hold one of the helmets from the picture from this famous photograph where the Israeli
Wow.
paratroopers marched into and reclaimed what we call the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which was a very touching thing for me and a very exciting thing. And of course, that's where my bar mitzvah was. So, near the
That is
holiest of the
wild.
holy.
That is wild. Yeah, those events of 1967 were pretty seminal for me. I remember them all vividly. Of course, I wasn't there,
Mhm.
but I wasn't really aware of what was going on over there until that week in June in 1967, and then it sort of all came up to me. I was 14 at the time, and I remember. Yeah, I'm the son of a Holocaust refugee, so I had all of that sort of background. But I remember sitting in a car with my dad. He was taking me for a haircut. The radio was on, and there was a reporter, a radio reporter, a Robert Capa type on a stone bridge in Jerusalem under gunfire, and describing what was going on in the battle for Jerusalem. And then I sort of woke up to history. So I remember that week very, very vividly.
Yeah, my introduction for a lot of people, the introduction to history was 9/11. But of course, I had two introductions to history. The first was that I'm from South Portland, Maine, which is where many of the Liberty ships that were built in World War II were built at the South Portland Shipbuilding Company, or the what was then the Maine Shipbuilding Company. And my grandfather, who of course was a boy then, used to take me there and talk about it. And so it always uh, struck me, or I always had sort of an understanding of the grandeur of it. And then, of course, the second moment was during the Second Intifada, where my father was very concerned that the I believe that it was the PLO had suggested that they were planning to murder Jewish professionals in the United States during the Second Intifada, which, for those unfamiliar with the history of terrorism, was not a far-fetched thing at that time, because, of course, Carlos the Jackal, who everyone knows was a PLFP left wing Sovietized terrorist. And I remember him coming home and being very concerned about that because, of course, as Steve and I talked about before this, my father has volunteered on a kibbutz in Israel. He's very connected to Israel. We've always had Israelis coming in and out of our household. And then when 9/11 happened, I came home and my father was there. And to us, it was part of a continuum. It was a surprise and a horrible moment, but one we saw as part of uh, an ongoing, what I think some have called the clash of civilizations, but I would say as part of an ongoing path of Islamic terror.
Yeah, I think most people are unaware of how long this has been going on.
Oh, it's been going
Uh,
on for a long time. Yeah.
Decades and decades, decades. And I think people are much slimmer on. It's interesting that we're talking about Dad Lit because when I first saw, I became aware of your show and what you're doing. Um, and of course, we're all bemoaning the sort of slow recession of literature for
Mhm.
men over the last, especially decade, but 2, 3 decades already, it's been sliding away. I um, sort of realized that these trends have been going on. This sort of violent trends have been sweeping across out of the Levant, across Europe, and now are in America. And yet, our young people who barely read anymore, all they're doing is pretty much looking at their phones, and
Yes.
they're totally unaware of history. I think our universities have failed our kids, not just in terms of the Middle East, but universal history around the world. They know very little. They adhere to slogans. They believe false narratives that their friends concoct and spread all over the internet. It's actually it's kind of alarming. But when you see what people, what particular in particular the younger generations believe, it's kind of stunning.
I, to me, what rings with it, and when I hear it described, and I like to think that the impulse on their behalf is a humanist one, that it's all based in sort of a vision of humanism. And my read of it is that there's a failure to understand the nature of force, right? So, um, government or policy or law is the application of values by force. War is the extension of government by other means, right? This is the Clausewitz idea
Yes.
that when you undertake a conflict or when you wage war, what you're trying to do is to impose the governing will of one group upon another group.
All right, diplomacy by other means.
Yeah, diplomacy by other means. Um, so to that extent, I think that everyone after who was born after 1991 was raised on the idea that war exists without force and that law or policing, for example, exists without force, and that the use of force isn't of itself an incitement to what we're seeing with rioting, with terrorism, and all these other things. They've sort of missed the part where if they're a victim of violent crime, the only way to resolve that or to pursue justice for them or to prevent future violent crime is for that threat of force to exist. And I don't think that anyone explained that to them. Right?
No,
They
yeah.
they just no one said force exists for a reason, and the application of it by governments and by, and in these ways serves a sensible purpose.
Defund the police, replace them
Yeah,
with
yeah,
social workers, and everything will
yes,
be fine.
yeah, yeah. Um that sort of suggests that law in and of itself is an act of violence when law is meant to uh, deter and control violence. And I guess if you have sort of a TikTok understanding of how law enforcement works, that's one way to approach it. But those who, for example, have dealt with violent crime or have experience with those sorts of things, see law enforcement in a much different way, in a much more human way.
That's absolutely true. And you have this whole class of of younger people who are, in a sense, decrying privilege while being the most privileged class we have, and they're making rules and regulations up that are not based on realities at all. They don't live in neighborhoods where you've got to call a cop if you want to save your life, or you have to get armed
Yes.
yourself. And they spend their lives moving between university dorms, protests, and mommy's basement. So of course their view of the realities of life are a little bit skewed. But it can be dangerous when, and I use dangerous in quotes, when you have throngs and throngs of people like this who are actually influencing, government policy, either on a local level or a national level. And
Yes.
they do have influence, and you can see it if you're paying attention. You can see it in local government or even mid-level government. You can see what's happening in New York now, where an individual who is an extreme radical may be running the what was once the greatest city in the world within 6 months. So
Yeah.
this is no longer theoretical. This is the sort of the subversive, highly radical, extreme left ideology, coming across the ocean in waves, and it's turning into quite a storm. So I think this is going to be a very interesting part of the century.
Yes, almost definitely. There's almost a reverse because, of course, the far right used to be libertarian, which was extreme Locke, John Locke, uh,
Yes,
visionaries.
yes,
And the left has embraced that perception of humanity, which is that we're all intrinsically good and it's force that makes us bad. Where traditionally the left was actually quite Hobbesian, which is we need to enforce this, or else. The the capitalism will run amok and we'll have chaos and all those things. It's almost reversed itself where the right has become very Hobbesian and the left has embraced sort of the Locke vision. Uh, it, Interesting times.
Very interesting times.
Very interesting times, which, by the way, is a perfect time to talk about your books, which explore World War II most recently, and of course, which also explored the Middle East. And the Middle East, I believe, in the 1980s.
Yeah, my first books were espionage novels, and the first one came out in just after 1990, 1992, and that trilogy ran through to the early 2000s, and then I moved off into nonfiction, and I was, as you said, I was writing with Mike Durant, the Black Hawk Down story from the actual pilot's perspective. He was the Black Hawk pilot who was shot down and captured by Mohammed
Hmm.
Aidid and those people. And then
I've yes.
we wrote a book about the regiment, the Night Stalkers, a whole another nonfiction book. And I was in Afghanistan. I wrote a book with a photographer named Robert Cunningham. And, in between all this stuff, Dan, I also write. I was a magazine editor for a long time. I do ghost writing,
Hmm.
which is really, I don't know how many people understand that space. Um, but an awful lot of what you see on the shelves in popular fiction from quote unquote celebrity authors, authors with names, is often written by somebody like me,
Yes.
who's who's in between his passion novels and just writing for the buck, which I've done many times.
Hmm.
Without shame, it's a wonderful thing to pursue because while you don't get credit, you also don't get critiqued.
You escape. Yes, you escape all of that. Yes.
Okay, but I mean, sometimes one of my clients will get a starred review on Publishers Weekly in which, Publishers Weekly just lauds this person's literary talent, and that person hasn't contributed a word. It's all me. But that's the price you pay for that anonymity, and the check always clears, so it doesn't really matter. But
I would say that in terms of guaranteed money, ghostwriting must be even better than writing for yourself, because ultimately a lot of publishers are paying for the influence versus paying for the work itself is a thing that some people have noticed.
yeah, for sure. And usually, if you are lucky enough to acquire a ghost job, which I've done many times, but they're not always, you almost always have to have an agency representative who
Yeah.
knows all the editors in the business and so forth. And one of them will call them up and say, just for example, the Tom Clancy franchise needs a new writer because they're sick of so and so. And,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is,
yeah.
and then that ghostwriter winds up with a very solid contract, and it's a franchise that's going to get paid quite an advance. It's not like you're a mid-list author and hoping that your publisher will throw you a decent couple of bucks for the next novel, sort of thing. Those ghostwriting jobs are very lucrative, and not always, but for the most part they're good gigs. And the other thing is that, this as a writer, when you're writing your own stuff, you're much more circumspect about the language, you're much more careful, you're much more concerned about how a paragraph reads. When you're writing a thriller for some guy who's a Hollywood star and everybody knows he doesn't write his own books, you just sit there and you hammer away, and
Oh yeah,
it's
I
it.
mean you're basically just aiming to hit story beats, I
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah. It's very
I've never
liberating.
done this, but yeah, yeah, yeah. You're doing the seven acts. You're establishing that your character's a nice guy. he's presented with an impossible situation, and then he has to work his way out of it. That sort of thing.
Yeah, of course, ghostwriters have to jump through some hoops to make sure that the franchise, whatever it is, likes the proposed plot. But
Yeah.
it's just not that difficult. Now, I know we're sort of off on a tangent talking about ghostwriting, but I'm sure that
Well, this is interesting.
yeah.
It's interesting. I don't know if you know this. You're the first best-selling author that we've had on the Dad Lit Pod.
Oh
I've
well,
been
thank you.
going, yes, I've been going for about 6 months. We've had some terrific authors, but and even some MWA finalists and a Pushkin finalist, but
Those are the
we've never had a best-selling author. So I'm very excited to that you were willing to come on and chat with us and chat with the dads.
oh, I first of all, I really appreciate that. Second of all, bestseller, as you know, can be a fluke. I mean, there are writers out there who deserve Pulitzers, and I've read them, and they can't get, a $20,000 advance. So, it's
I
very
yes.
complimentary, but best-selling author is like it happens to some people who deserve it and some people who don't.
I think it's interesting because, of course, Patterson has railed against the New York Times bestseller list and suggested that he's had some books that should have been on there and then they weren't. And to me, it has cachet from a traditional standpoint, right?
Yes.
uh, because when I was a kid, and this is a weird thing, and everyone's going to make fun of me for it, but when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a historian. So I used to read the Sunday Book Review, and my dad got the New York Times, and I was obsessed with reading the Sunday Book Review, and I loved reading about all the new books that came out. And so to me, the New York Times Sunday Book Review was the be all and the end all of human endeavor. That was it. That was it.
It
That
still is.
determined,
It still is for a lot of
yes,
people.
yes.
It still is.
But then I heard about what the Us Weekly, and the other ones that are largely based on actual numbers going out the door. And then I found out that a lot of New York Times bestsellers are determined by library purchases, and that library buying is so important to the publishing industry and school buying. And that is why, for example, middle grade and YA authors are so financially successful in the market today because libraries and school libraries buy them right up because they want the kids to read. And I thought that was a fascinating thing. And of course, now the New York Times has broken it all out, but it used to be a focus on primarily adult books.
Yeah, totally. And when I first got on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was with a nonfiction book, there were only, as I recall, there was the nonfiction book list, the fiction book list,
Yep.
and then maybe there was a paperback list, and that's all. But now you see
Yes.
this whole range of, and the other thing is that the New York Times, being on the New York Times bestseller list, or being called a best-selling author, if you were called a best-selling author, it pretty much meant that that was the New York Times. The reference was to the New York Times.
Yeah.
Now people are calling themselves best-selling authors because they have been given a bestseller rank for one day on
On Amazon.
some
Yes.
obscure some obscure poll somewhere, and they just grab that little medallion and they put that all over there. So it's like everything else, it's become sort of the meaning is diluted somewhat.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because you can be a New York Times best-selling author of a particular kind of book and then not be able to sell your next book. So that medallion or whatever it is nice to have. The publishers always love putting it on your cover, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have an easy time of it. Publishing is a brutal business.
Oh
It's a
yeah.
brutal business.
I compare it to professional sports, right? Professional sports, on any given day, you can have the best day of your career or the worst day of your career and not have a career at all.
Correct.
And it takes so much work and so much effort and so much before time. And and even then, there's no sort of like minor league for training up authors who are going to succeed. And I have to
No.
say, before I sat down, and now I've now written 4 manuscripts. I do have an agent, but I've not gotten any of them published. I've learned to so appreciate and respect authors who have made it happen and to understand the underlying business element and what is inevitably going to be taken out and put in to any work. It changes your whole experience with any book that you read.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, the not that the reading public should realize what goes into preparing, writing, marketing, and I know you've talked to my publicist Liz Malone, who's
Yeah.
magnificent, and she's taken writers, particularly dad lit writers,
Oh, yeah.
hate marketing, and she's one of those people who found a niche, sort of the way you have with
Yeah.
the podcast, is that she realized that she could relieve all these poor authors of their hatred of marketing, and she does it. She's fantastic. I don't have to think about that stuff anymore, which is just
Well,
great.
the you've heard a couple of the episodes. One of the things is that while dad lit authors don't necessarily like marketing, they don't like, going on social media and social mediaing.
Right.
They do love to sit and talk about their books. I've since I've started this, I have never met a guy who didn't want to talk about their writing, who didn't want to talk about their inspiration for their writing or how their family figures in. If it's anything, it's usually, if there's anything that shies it away, it's because they're generally shy and they worry that they won't have anything interesting to say. And to that, I always respond, I don't actually, either until I sit down and have a conversation with somebody.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
like I have to, when I want to say something interesting, I have to sit and work at it and write it until I sit down and have the conversation. But I always find that people have interesting things to say, and dads especially, because contrary to Hollywood's perception of the bumbling, fat dad who's, barely able to balance the checkbook, the dads I meet are all very competent. And in between bringing the kids to soccer and working and cooking dinner, they're also writing books and engaging with other people. And it's it's um it's so interesting when you think that you have a hard time finding the books that you're gonna like, and then you start a podcast for dads, and then the dads are like, "Yeah, would you read my book?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course. That's what I want to read." Doing dad lit over here. Want dad lit.
it's it's amazing because I have watched, probably over the last 2 decades, how things have completely shifted in the publishing world. Men's adventure fiction was huge
Yeah.
even 20 years ago. Brad Thor and Clancy and all these guys who were just putting out books, making money hand over fist. They were turning them into movies and stuff. And that just tumbled upside down in the blink of an eye. And now, if you talk to your agent or mine or anyone else's agent, like I said to my agent, just must have been a couple of weeks ago. So what's going on? What are people buying nowadays? Because it doesn't. I sort of. I'm going to write what I'm going to write, and then after the manuscript is done, then I worry about whether or not it's going to go to a publisher or if I'm going to have a contract or whatever. And he said, "I have no freaking idea."
No one does. No one has any clue.
But it used to be, Dan, that you knew what people were buying.
Yeah.
They're buying male thriller fiction, spy stuff, whatever, detective novels, horror, whatever. And now it seems like nobody has a clue except for young adults.
Yep.
Vampire stuff. Fantasy novels that are 700 pages long.
Yep.
And
that have a lot of sex in them. It's sexy fantasy. It's my wife reads it.
That stuff and a lot of wokey stuff where the publishers are trying to comply with the latest social TikTok
what's called
trend.
Yeah, the message. I like the term the message. They're trying to comply with the message. Yes.
And so that pretty much leaves Dad Lit hanging off a very high cliff by our fingernails. But it's such a big world that I'm always confident that there were readers. Sometimes there are more readers, sometimes there are less. But I think there's always space for this kind of literature and men's fiction, dad's fiction. There are always readers out there. You just have to know how to find them.
There's definitely that's what I'm trying, right? This is what I'm setting out to do, is to try and figure out. One of the questions I have is, how do you market to dads? Like, how do you convince dads that this book must be read? Because you and I both know that dads will read nonfiction. Like, if you put out a book about a heroic dog that serves with a SEAL team and jumps out of the back of an aircraft in like the pocket, that book will sell. Because my father-in-law has bought 5 of them. And he loves dogs, and he will buy a heroic dog book, and he will say, and he'll drop it off to me, and he'll say, this is one of the best books. This is about a heroic dog. It's spectacular. And I can't argue with him, because heroic dog books are beloved by dads, because dads have dogs, and we love to read books about heroism. And there's something pure and terrific about a heroic dog. And what I would like to convince the dads out there is to read books about heroic humans again.
Okay, I agree with you, but I have a proposal. Proposal. If you were to come back to your father-in-law and say the following.
Yes.
I have a novel for you.
Yes.
It's about a heroic dog, but it's written by a combat dog handler who did six tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Would he read it?
Yeah, absolutely, because it has a dog in it.
Okay, so now we've crossed over from nonfiction to fiction, because it's the same theme. That's like, my books about the Night Stalkers. The people who are reading those books about the Night Stalkers that are nonfiction will cross over. Those dads will cross over into fiction about the Night Stalkers if the author has some background or the characters have some background. Like, I think that a lot of
things have to have weight. I think
they have to have weight. They have to have weight, and often the authors have to have weight.
Yes.
I'm the type of guy who, now, I will read detective fiction by someone who's not a detective.
Mm-hmm.
but I won't read about a 75th Ranger Regiment sergeant by someone who's never been in the Army. Won't even go near it.
Yeah, that's understandable.
And I think lots of dads are that way. Like they, as you said, they put weight to it. They might read a book about a banker who's gone off the rails, but it better be by a banker, like John Grisham's books.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah, it
was
has
he,
to.
why was he so successful? Because he had worked for, quote unquote, the firm.
Yeah. Yeah, it has to have authenticity.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's a big part of dad lit, is that it
Yes.
has to have authenticity. It's got to be either by somebody who's been there, or that person has lived the life somehow in research deep. It usually has to have, it has to come with some bona fides, or they're not going to pick it up.
No, no, I 100% agree with that. I think that you know, I was I've been reading a lot of Mick Herron lately. Slow Horses.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's very good, but the plots are good and the dialogue is good. But underlying that, the action isn't necessarily believable to me, right? And I don't know whether that's because I've worked in government and I know other people who have worked in government. And to me, this sort of idea of the institution against its own members as a constant plot device just doesn't strike true to me because the people who I know who are in these institutions are very dedicated and very thoughtful and very honest. And so while it's very interesting and it's very fun to read Mick Herron, that sort of weight of, for example, what Clancy has always provided, or what, for example, Terminal List provided, doesn't necessarily show through with Mick Herron, while the books are very entertaining.
So that's the MI5 stuff.
Yeah, the Slow Horses, it's the Gary Oldman series.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And I've noticed that in the series as well,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
why.
It's always them against themselves. It's always Britain against Britain. And I think a part of that comes from just sort of an insecurity of talking about global affairs in books, and about drawing moral lines. And to me, that, like the new Tom Clancy stuff with what's his name from The Office, for example, never struck true to me, not only because I live in DC and my wife worked at one of the facilities they supposedly were at, but Tom Clancy was never pulling his punches. Tom Clancy was always up front and always honest about who the two sides were and what the reality of those two sides were ideologically. And that adds weight to things and it gives it legitimacy. And I think that's missing from a lot of contemporary thrillers.
And why is that missing? Is it because the authors have gotten sloppy?
Now, I think it's discomfort. It's
Really?
it's it's autorial and publisher discomfort and the sort of desire not to bring that to Hollywood. It's there was too much critiquing of the sort of third world as the enemy,
Oh yes, yes, yes,
and
yes, yes.
there was too much. We cannot present the third world as the enemy. The third world, has to just be the setting, but the enemy comes from within.
Yes, yes, we've
And
seen this all the time. See this all
yeah,
the time. Well, you
yes,
just mentioned the Terminal List is the ultimate
is the ultimate example of that. Yeah,
is the ultimate
yeah,
example. But now, why Jack? I mean, I don't really remember what inspired him to write that, but my guess is because he's so wily and commercially oriented, and he is.
Yes, he's
He's
very
the
smart.
he's the most brilliant, marketer out there in terms of our current literary scene or thriller scene or whatever.
Yeah,
He probably that probably grew. I'm guessing here, having spent a lot of time in the military, it probably grew out of some things he saw that by virtue of extension you could move from incompetence to
malice. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So, he is drawn from, the frustrations and special operators all over the world have these frustrations because on the one hand, they've been trained to be basically, the dark arts assassins. And then they discover in the field that the green light is being commanded by an attorney somewhere. So you always have this sort of a conflict between the guys who are doing the work and the guys who are, having liquid lunches in DC and making decisions for them. It's very tough. So I can
yeah.
see a book like that evolving from the battles with the bureaucracy into something much more evil and suggestive of, conspiracy and so forth.
Yeah, that's ultimately the way that it's found expression, I think, and even in slow horses. At the same time, I know those liquid lunch people. They don't have liquid lunches. They're eating they're eating horrible bagels uh, every morning. They go into meetings and windowless rooms, and they have horrible bagels and lukewarm coffee, which they then put into the government microwave that has to be purchased from Staples. And if it ever breaks down, they'll never get a new one. They'll have to wait, a week to get a new one. And they are very, very committed to the safety of the American people. And they don't make that much money.
Right.
And and so I suppose maybe that living here near our nation's capital has probably corrupted me in this regard, and prevented me from truly enjoying the idea that all of us civil servants are corrupt, are corrupt thieves, just waiting to flip on America, and sell out our special operators. But it just doesn't feel like that. It feels much more Tom Clancy, which should give everyone confidence, I think.
No, I wouldn't say. I want to rewind here. I wouldn't say that that our civil servants who are in support of special operations troops are the ones who are frustrating the efforts at all.
Yeah, yeah.
My
No, I
my
wasn't suggesting that.
no,
Yeah, yeah.
my
That you were
my
saying that.
my implication is that there's always a jag somewhere who's going to put the kibosh on a missile strike because he's worried about, the legal liabilities that might come back at
Yeah,
him for having greenlit such a thing. And
yeah.
that's very frustrating for operators in the field who can actually see what's going on downrange. And you've got some guy who's, never heard a shot fired in anger and is making decisions for them. I'm not implying that, the support systems for all of these operations are spoiled, corrupt, or overpaid in any way, because they're not. And we all know they're not.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. This is the thing, but it's more fun dramatically if they are, I
Well, what
think.
about the thing that you brought up, though, that I think is really has changed a lot of men's fiction, which is the political correct aspect of who you can make a villain and who you are not allowed to villainize. You
Yes.
are, like,
I
for
mean,
example,
yeah. I mean, even in let's take Rainbow Six, which is my favorite example.
right,
Uh, the villain in Rainbow Six, or the villains, are all former Soviet operatives being guided by a billionaire and Bill Gates style environmentalist. And there's a reason why that movie has never been made, even though it is clearly Tom Clancy's best story. I think there's no question. It's his best book. It's a masterpiece of dad lit, in my opinion. And I think if you were to try and remake that, the kids today would be like, left wing European terrorists? What is that?
Right, right. They did not know the Red Brigades.
Nope, they didn't know the Red Brigades or the IRA or Carlos
Bader
the
Meinhof,
Jackal,
Bader
Bader
Meinhof.
Meinhof. Nope, no Bader Meinhof. No familiarity with Black September
Nope.
or the PFLP, or well, now they've been introduced to Hezbollah, but
And they loved them.
and they love them, which is so bizarre to me.
But
Um,
when you deal with, and I was in Hollywood for a while writing terrible screenplays, but it was a gig. And it used to be when I was there, maybe I'm thinking early 2000s, there was no restriction in terms of political correctness or the social aspects of who you were deciding to make a villain or not a villain. And now
mhm.
I was just talking to somebody that I was doing a ghost job for, and this person's in Hollywood involved in a film, and they had to extract all the references in the film to uh, Chinese villains, as in
Yes,
mainland
because
China, because of the financing.
yes, yep,
So you have controls that are coming into creativity and stripping it of
uh,
realities, actually.
yes. I mean, True Lies, for example, is one of the great action movies of the 1990s. You
Couldn't
could
make it now.
not make True
No,
Lies.
no, you
And the
couldn't.
villain in True Lies is Osama bin Laden,
Yes, but you could not make that movie now.
but you couldn't make it.
No,
Yeah,
pretty wild. So it goes
it's
the
wild.
same thing. The same thing happens now with Dadlit, with men's fiction.
Hmm.
The submissions, and this is another thing. And I'm old now, so I can say all this stuff. You're young, so stay.
Yeah.
So
So I'm
you're
gonna
young,
get
so stay out of the way. Just stay out of the
yes.
way, and I'll go in there.
Yeah.
You have men's fiction. A guy like me, for example. Now, this hasn't happened to me yet, because in particular that over the course of the last decade I've been writing things that are historical fiction, so there you can't really argue with them because they're based on things that happen.
Yeah.
You don't have
Yeah.
to get, nobody can say to you, well, that character can, how come you don't have this kind of character, that kind, because they weren't there and this is what actually happened.
Yeah.
But now a young guy like you writes a magnificent manuscript
Hmm.
that's just thrilling, a page turn. But you have the wrong person. You have the wrong, uh, let's say, demographic for your villainous. Okay.
Yes.
That manuscript is going to get passed through a throng of millennials before it even gets near the editor.
Yeah.
And it's not going to get to the editor because they're going to put the kibosh on it for social reasons that have nothing to do with sales, marketing, accuracy, fine writing, thrilling writing. Dan isn't going to know why his agent called him up and said, "I can't get arrested over at Morrow now. I don't know why," and you won't
Yeah.
know why. But it is going to be the gatekeepers now who are not your fans. And I say this to, like, I have a wonderful author whose name is Dominic Piper. You should look him up because
Dominic Piper.
you'll love
Let
his
me
stuff.
let me say that to the Dadlit community. Check out Dominic Piper because I'm gonna check him out and maybe we'll get him on the pod.
Oh, he's a fantastic to talk to. He has a series of detective novels. The first one is Kiss Me When I'm Dead.
Hmm.
And I found him by accident. See, this is when X or Twitter or whatever it is magnificent. Came across him on there, bought one of his books, and was totally enthralled. And he in turn found me a British editor for my last novel who could check out all of the accuracies or inaccuracies in World War II North Africa about British troops. So it was one of those
Nice.
matches made in
Nice.
heaven sort of thing. He's a fantastic writer. And he's put out maybe 5 of these novels so far. Couldn't get arrested, even though he's a very successful television writer in England, in the UK. And I know why you couldn't get arrested from the major publishers, because his main character is a bondish, sort of misogynistic, sexualized tough guy, and they ain't buying. They ain't buying. So his audience is self-made.
You see, it's so disappointing. And I'll say it this way, because that character is, or having an imperfect style character like that results in different decision making than a character who isn't like that. Does that make sense? Like
Makes absolute sense.
a pure as white, this is the problem with it as I see, because one of my novels has a very unlikable character, and I love him. I personally think he's hilarious. I wrote him, my friend and I, he's a detective, and he's surly, and he's always drunk, and he's always saying horrible things to people. And to me, it's hilarious because I wrote him. I wrote him to be that way. I, he's so much fun, and the decisions he makes are tied to that irreverence. The brilliance he has is tied to that irreverence. When you create a character like that, the fun of that character is that they think in a different way than you do. It might be problematic, probably is. At the same time, thinking differently results in different outcomes. It results in different judgments. It results in different trajectories of the story. And this idea of the kind of like perfect ninny who's always going to be the guy who says the right thing or makes the right decision, it's just boring. It's really boring.
And that's why it's not selling.
Yeah, and that's why you can't get dads to buy it, because it has no weight, because the interiority feels false,
Exactly.
right? It's
Exactly.
it's idolized. It's the sort of Jack Reacher where everyone around me is corrupted by being dumb and being weak and being, selfish and all these other things. But I, Jack Reacher, am the most brilliant person in the room. And Lee Child's very successful. At the same time, I can only read Jack Reacher being smarter than everybody else in the room so many times, right?
He also developed Reacher how many years ago?
Very recently. He was like me, he was in his 40s when he got started.
Yes, but he's retired now and his son's writing them. So he started 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So
And
that's been going on for a long time.
his editor, David Highfill, over at Morrow, um, recognized that at the time, he was the perfect hero for changing times. He was still
Yeah,
bigger than
yeah.
life, but there's always a thirst for a certain kind of hero. I remember my first agent, great agent, Al Zuckerman at Writer's House. When he took me
Hmm.
on, I was a kid, and he was handling Ken Follett.
Hmm.
And that's when Ken Follett had, their first novel together was The Eye of the Needle.
Hmm.
And it was huge. And those things were formulaic. A
Yep.
lot of those novels at the time, and then everybody was copying Ken Follett, and lots of those things were they followed a particular pattern. But the heroes were always flawed. Nobody was interested in somebody who was pure as the driven snow, as you'd say, because it's
Who wants
boring.
it? Who
No.
wants
And
it?
and also Len Dayton wrote that way too. The greats wrote
Yeah.
that way. Le Carre's espionage novels are all about, his greatest hero, George Smiley, is a cuckold.
Hmm.
And nowadays, everything that you're able to put a label on cannot be acceptable, and it as a major character, and everything gets sort of homogenized, and therefore your dads are not sitting on the beach reading dad lit. I don't know what they're doing. They're listening to a
They're
podcast like this, or
yes,
reading.
they're listening to the Dad Lit podcast going, when's
Maybe.
Dan gonna give me something I actually want, like a heroic dog book?
There you go. There you go. Or Dominic Piper, or
Or Dominic Piper.
one of
Yes.
these guys who is not afraid to write what they want to write, and to hell with whether or not the publishing world wants it. Those are the guys.
Yeah, but when is the publishing anyway? You've obviously read or listened to my, how do we get men to read? Is
Yes.
Dadlit really gone?
Yes. I don't think it is.
I don't think it is either. I think that the writers are all still there. The writers
Yes.
are all there. The audience is trying to find something that's not going to bore them to tears. And unfortunately, the nature of sort of instant gratification media, uh, the that's always present on the cell phone. And they could be reading on the cell phone, but they're getting the instant gratification media on the cell phone as an alternative, or they're just working hard and busy. And so you really need to provide them with something that they're really going to like and that they're really going to get into. And so that's the challenge, and that's what we're doing here with Dadlet, is trying to find how to do that. Having now read I read the first story in your noir trilogy, and I started your paratrooper novel, and those are two perfectly good examples of stuff that dads would like. A scuba diving short story about a guy trying to figure out who murdered his best friend, and a fairly intricate, I would say, not the word isn't esoteric, it's a specific and very interesting unit within Special Operations Executive that was in North Africa during the darkest times of the British World War II experience, are two interesting ways to set that up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, Menage a Noir, I'm not a prolific short story writer, but I sort of write in the style of the old hands at short story writing, and I am not, you
It's
know,
pulpy. I'll say that. It is very
yeah,
pulpy.
it's
Yeah.
pulpy, and I meant it to be, because it's noir. It's not even classic noir, but it's in the noir vein,
Yeah.
and I I'm aware, very aware of what technology has done to the reader, because when you pick up something now, Dan, and you look at it and it looks like an interesting article, if your eye is going to the bottom of the screen to see that little tag that says 3-minute read,
Oh, yeah.
you're lost,
You're doomed.
because you're not going to pick up The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and slog through 40 pages of setup, because you're
Nope.
so spoiled by this. Your patience factor has been stripped,
Oh,
and
yeah.
now you want the instant gratification. So I think dads are more capable of hanging in there if they know there's a payoff.
Yes.
But everybody has had to retune their literature, or their thriller literature, to some degree, because the patience factor is no longer what it used to be. So, with that particular story, a Dead Drop that you're talking about with the scuba diver, I did not modify that. I wrote that years ago. I didn't change it at
Hmm.
all to satisfy anybody's need for speed.
Yeah.
And in The Last of the Seven, the novel that you're reading about World War II, that's so based on truth that I didn't need to.
Yeah. You also front load the end of the initial part, which is a very good tactic of bringing out the inciting incident and making the journey a mystery, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah. Yes. Which is a thing that when people see sort of when you go to see the movie Nobody with Bob Odenkirk and he's sitting in front of the police officers all beaten up, it's because most audiences are not giving the director enough time to see the first 7 minutes of the movie where he's living his normal life. And the director is basically like, okay, I got to front load this. I got to get that inciting incident because we're in a thriller and it's got to happen like that. And it's got to click with people. And so they front load it and then you get some time to introduce your characters and have a little detail and a little,
Yes.
you know what I mean?
Yes,
Uh,
I have not seen. I Odenkirk is Better Call Saul, and
yes,
he's terrific. I haven't seen what's it called? Nobody.
it's called Nobody. It's very
Okay,
good. It's very fun. It's just a fun movie. It's a fun action movie.
and he's great. And I just started watching the John Hamm Friends and Neighbors, and it opens the
Hmm.
exact same way. Dan,
Yeah.
they developed a hook where he you see him lying on the floor of a mansion, or he's tripping down the stairs and he winds up falling in a pool of blood next to a corpse. So
Yeah.
and then he said, "How did I get here?" And now it's all flashback. Now that's a technique that a lot of us use in all kinds of writing. You have an inciting incident and then you have time to go back and explain why we're here.
Yeah, because now you sort of have to, right?
Yes, of
Like in
course.
yeah, in Old Yeller, for example, you could have the dad, you know, have a conversation with his son and leave, and then the problems start to pile up. But now with the sophistication and the attention span of audiences, something like that has to be written into the story. It has to come up pretty quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that much has changed. And I think we if we're going to write to get if we want to get dads to bring their hardcovers and paperbacks to the beach again, we do need to understand that they do want to have a hint off the top 20 pages that something cool, rough, and enthralling is going to happen here. Because
Yes.
if we do the girl with the dragon tattoo and talk about finances and I can't remember, but you
She
know
had she had a list of items that she bought at IKEA at some point in that book, and I said, "What in God's name? Why are we listing off items at IKEA? This must have some payoff later." Nope. No
yeah.
payoff
No,
at
and
all.
it was a huge those books were huge bestsellers, but he was not afraid to indulge his developmental atmospheric setup for 50 pages or so, and I hung in there because it was brilliantly done. You can't
Yes.
do that. You can't do it anymore unless
No.
you're already so big that you've got 500,000 fans that are going to read whatever you write.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing that I've realized. And I was just asked to cut a lot out of the first 10% of my novel to get to make that initial incident that much more potent, and then to get to the the not really the inciting incident, but the twist or the hook that much
Yes.
faster.
Yes.
And it is 100%. Unless you have an established relationship with your audience, that has to happen, it seems, in order for you to get like a big publisher on board, to have faith that you're gonna like really pop in there and make it happen.
That's the truth. And I'm doing the same thing right now with the book I wrote how long ago, 10, 15 years ago, about Afghanistan. And at the time, I was still belaboring under the illusion that I could get away with a nice, long, descriptive opening to what is essentially a war slash thriller.
Yeah.
And I looked at it again and said, you've got 23 pages of setup here before the first shot is fired, and it's a forward operating base in Afghanistan. They ain't going to hang in there, Steve. They
Nope.
ain't going to hang in there. You better take a lot of this stuff and move it to a reflective area later and get to the gunfire,
Yeah.
or the dads ain't going to read it.
The bullets got to be whizzing over, and the person has to hear in the back of their mind, you cannot give up this position no matter what. That's
There you go.
that's just what you have to do.
That's right.
And it's an interesting thing, because those of us who are, raised on the classics, didn't have that sort of rapidity, or that rapid to the inciting incident,
No.
and discovering it is, discovering it after you read like Raymond Chandler novels, for example.
Right.
uh you love Raymond Chandler novels, you love all these other things, and now that you've found it out, it is a hunt. It's a hunt to make that happen. But I respect it because the audience needs it, right?
Oh yeah, you can't be judgmental or snobby about the trends that have overtaken our literary scene. You have to respect your audience and know what they're looking for. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you want to write poetry.
Yeah.
But if you want, if you want to write a great story that entertains your readers and they no longer have quite the patience runway that they had 30 years ago, you're either going to get with the program or you're going to be doing something else, because they ain't going to read you. It doesn't mean that you have to whore or sell yourself out. And
Yeah.
I'm using you, I mean one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
One. Yes.
but you can't do what Heller did in Catch 22. Can't do it anymore.
No.
You can't do Vonnegut. You can't do Norman Mailer. Forget it.
Yeah.
And so we all have to be who we are in this time and space without selling ourselves out, but knowing that we want our readers to hang in there as the story builds and builds until they cannot put it down anymore. That's the key.
Yes. Well, I've said this. People ask me, I don't do reviews on the podcast because that's not what I'm necessarily about, right? I'll say, this is a really good book. You should really go out and look at it. But the other side of that is, my definition of good is, was the action clear and did I want to keep reading? If those two qualities are there,
That's mine too.
I can't argue with it. You
That's
just
mine
can't
too.
argue with it. Yeah.
That's mine too. And it's a big pet peeve of mine when I start reading somebody. If I have to reread a paragraph to understand what happened, I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah. The action should be clear. Whatever the author needs to do to make that action clear, that's what they need to do. I'm not going to, judge that. Whether that's good or not is determined by whether or not I understood it and whether or not I wanted to keep reading,
Yes.
which um, I think, as best as I can tell, is what everybody should be shooting for.
Yes.
After that, the superlatives are terrific, inspired, emotionally driven. But if I want to keep reading and if the action is clear, then that's it. That is good. That is a good novel or good story or good writing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yep. So do you want to talk about we're way over, but
Are
because
we?
but because it's fascinating to get to talk to you, uh uh obviously what ships did you serve on with MSC?
Oh, just one.
Yeah, Arthur
The
Huddleston,
the USS Saugatuck.
the Saugatuck. Was it a
It
tanker?
it was an oiler refueler, and
Yeah.
it had been a Liberty ship, I think, in World War II. It still had the 40 millimeter mounts on it.
Yeah, so it was a Z type. It's
It
with the
was like
old.
it was like 600 feet,
Yeah.
and it had a well deck and those enormous hatch covers with the big, huge butterfly closures on them.
Yeah.
And it had a catwalk from the bridge to all the way up forward to the captain's quarters.
Yeah.
And man, that thing was horrific in the North Sea.
I bet it was cold.
Horrific. Oh my God. It was either freezing cold or we were boiling on it. We went
Yeah.
everywhere. We went to Central America, South America, then we crossed the Atlantic. Yeah, I basically threw up in every continent multiple times. So
Yeah, the old liberties do not travel well. And they're also very slow.
oh
They're
yeah.
insanely slow.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I don't think it
They
had a keel.
You just had to have tucks push it. You could
It was wow, that was some adventure. Yeah.
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 And so what
1973.
what convinced you to do that?
Too much reading.
Oh, yeah. Well, so because I happen to have ready access to this, I have a list of merchant marine authors from the 20th century who were in the merchant marine. You want to hear some of these, which, by the
Yes.
way, you were clearly a part of. Uh, Eugene O'Neill,
Yes.
Irwin Allen Ginsberg.
Irwin Allen he had an
Yes,
additional
he
name.
had he had an additional name. Uh, Herbert Huncke,
yes.
Jean-Louis Lebré de Kerouac, otherwise known as Jack
Jack
Kerouac,
Kerouac.
a guy named John Griffith Cheney, otherwise known as Jack London.
Wow.
You'll like this one, Louis Dearborn Lamore, a
Louis L'Amour
merchant
was in the Merchant
mariner.
Marine?
He
No
was,
kidding.
he was, as was Richard Scott Prather, who's the author of the Shel Scott novel series.
Wow.
Now, I always thought that Steinbeck was also a merchant mariner. But this is interesting because I looked this up today. Because, of course, Steinbeck talks about the Merchant Marine because he's out in California during that whole period and afterwards. So Steinbeck was not in the Merchant Marines, but he was a war correspondent with the Army, and he served with and landed with the beach jumpers. The U.S. Navy beach jumpers were the special operations unit that used to
Yes.
land, and the commander of the beach jumpers was Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
You're kidding me.
Yes, yes, who, for those who don't know, very big Hollywood movie star in the 1920s and 30s, and he achieved a very high rank in the Naval Reserve and decided to start this one group that did beach jumping or faux landings to convince the Germans to go to different places. And then, of course, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., when he was in the Navy Reserve, was on the USS Wichita, which is a cruiser, during convoy PQ-17. And those who are in the Merchant Marine are very familiar with convoy PQ-17, which is the most devastating German victory of the Battle of the Atlantic
Wow. Yes.
from Halifax to Archangel as a convoy. So I just thought that was an interesting thing that I would bring up, being a Merchant Marine historian, is that a lot of big authors, including Stephen Hartov,
Wild. I did not
merchant
know that.
mariners of the
Yeah.
20th century.
Did not know that. Did not
Yes,
know that.
yes, particularly the beats. They're all of them, but Steinbeck are all or were all merchant mariners, which makes sense because, of course, back then, merchant mariners were not in the military, tended to be very steeped in union activity, and
Yes.
a lot of left wing thought and a lot of left wing ideas.
That's really
Uh,
interesting because that you say that because when I decided that I was going to quit college, I left college in the middle after 2 years at BU.
mhm.
I went back a year and a half later after some adventures in the Middle East and finished my degree. But I decided that I wanted to go to sea, and that's how I was going to see the world and so forth. And I had no idea how to go about that. And I had an uncle who was whose friends were sort of nefarious union characters, and they were all from Jersey.
Yep.
And they said, "Kid, come on down to the Union Hall in New York. We'll take care of you." And that's what happened. I went down to the Union Hall, and they gave me a number, and they said, when they call your number, hold that up. So they called my number. I held it up, and they said, "Okay, go down to Norfolk. Here's a plane ticket. You're getting on a ship." I had no idea what I was doing. No idea.
That's, welcome to going up through the house pipe, as it were.
Yes.
Learning up through the house pipe,
Oh
which is
man, I
how
had no
my
idea what I was doing. No idea.
yeah, which is how my father-in-law learned through the house pipe to be a merchant mariner.
Yep. No, no Piney Point, nothing. Just show up, get on the ship. And when I saw that ship, then I walked out. I took the plane, I got in a taxi, whatever. I walked onto the wharf, and there's this beautiful naval vessel sitting there. It looked like it had just been spit shined, and I thought, "Wow, that's going to be great. That's a pretty ship." And the bosun shows up and he says to me, "No, kid, that ain't yours. That's yours."
Yeah, a little 12 knot.
Yeah, exactly. 600-foot scow. Yeah, yeah.
Like
I'll
a
show you.
brick,
I'll
like
show
a
you.
brick
Like a
on the
brick.
water.
I'll show you pictures. I'll show you pictures sometime. Yeah, pretty wild.
And then were you a lone soldier when you went over?
Yes, yes. Yeah. I went over, wound up in the Middle East a few weeks before the Yom Kippur War. I was, doing the usual volunteer kibbutz thing. The war broke out. I stayed for the year, went back to BU, but I knew I was going to go back over there and be a paratrooper, and that's what I did. Stupid American.
Yeah, what inspired that? Jewish self-defense?
Yeah, you come from. My mother was a Holocaust refugee. The Nazis had killed most of the family in Austria. A bunch of tough Austrian Jews, most of whom wound up dead. And then I figured, well, um, this is sort of the way to not wind up dead, or to go defend the culture, the people, the homeland, whatever. And that's what I did. Plus, there was this whole back then. There was this whole um, sort of fantastical image of the IDF paratroopers, which was accurate because they were a bunch of
Yeah.
real tough mofos. And they had taken, in the 6 Day War, they had taken Ammunition Hill, which was kind of a slaughter. And that's what I wanted to be. So that's what I wound up being. Nowadays, well, everything's different nowadays. But back then, There were no foreigners in my battalion. I was the only American in that battalion. There was one other American in the sister battalion, and that was it.
Yeah. What was the unit?
Well, it was the 35th Airborne Brigade and it was the 202nd Battalion, and then the sister battalion was the 890th. And
Okay.
I was a rare bird, and it was it was the adventure of a lifetime.
Yeah, would they have you jumping out of C-47s? Or they have a
You know,
better
it's you know,
plane?
it's funny that you say that because we still had in the IAF at the time, we still had 17 fully functioning, they called them Dakotas,
Yeah, yeah,
C-47s, many of which had been used in the drop on the Rhine and in Normandy.
yeah. Well,
Um,
they were all purchased from the United States in
yes,
parts and then
yes,
shipped over during 48 and
yes,
then rebuilt. Uh and I have to imagine. I mean, because they were flying like J4 Piper Cubs in 48
yes.
and then subsequently restocked with C-47s. God only knows
My
what they were dropping guys in like 67.
Well, in the Mitla Pass, they used C-47s,
Yeah,
but that was 56. So there were no drops in 67 except a
yeah,
couple of small special operations drops. We trained out of the backs of C-130s, not cargo, not ramp jumps, but
yeah.
side door jumps first. But then, when a little later on, in some other special operations stuff, I jumped C-47s maybe 10 times as well.
Jesus.
So then those aircraft had dropped
That's
American
like
paratroopers in Normandy.
that's like jumping out of a soda can.
Yes, yes, basically, yeah, that is correct. That is correct.
They're as thin as a soda can.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
anyone has ever been, I've been in a yeah, C-47 Dakota. It is as thin as a soda can.
yep,
And it's loud. And I imagine it's all you were doing the zip line when you were jumping out. And that tail is right next to your head by the time
yeah.
you get.
That tail is scary, and you're using a static line cable. And when you go out, you swear you're going to get cut in half by that
Oh yeah,
horizontal
by that
stabilizer.
tail. Yeah,
But
yeah.
nobody does. I mean, there are a couple of guys in the course of history have gotten somehow hung up with their chutes on those tails, but it doesn't happen often. But yeah, that was a long time ago. But yeah, we used to jump C-47s. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
my
C-130 was our aircraft. Though.
oh, okay. Yeah, my brother was in the 82nd Airborne and was an advanced infantryman in Iraq during the Iraq War. And of course, they never did any wartime jumps,
Right.
but he was a paratrooper. And of course, now what they do is they just sort of turn the plane and dump you out.
Yes.
The plane turns and you just sort of go out through that static line. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's fascinating. And then you ended up with the New York National Guard.
No, I ended up with the New York Guard, which is attached to the National Guard and the Division of Military and Naval Affairs. I was a major in
Oh,
the New York
okay.
Guard, not the New York National Guard, because I got to stay in longer, way past what would have been National Guard retirement age. And I was a task force commander on an Air Force base called Stewart Air National Guard Base. But that was fantastic. That was one of those things where, later in life, you think you're never going to get in a uniform again. And I volunteered for that. And that was a great thing. I really enjoyed that. That was great. Good
Oh, that's
service.
terrific. That's
Yeah.
terrific.
Yeah. Got
Uh,
to Afghanistan that way too. So it was a good deal.
mhm. Yes, the that's just fascinating. So this is needless to say, Dad lit listeners, when Stephen writes his books, they have weight.
I knew you'd wrap this up the way I wanted it to be. Thank you very
Yes,
much, Dan. Thank you
yes.
very much. So, man, when we, yeah, I know we're not supposed to say this on the air, but when are we getting together? When you get, I got to come down to Washington. We should keep doing this over adult beverages.
Oh yeah, absolutely. By all means, I'll have you down whenever you come down. I'm always here. I'm never going anywhere.
Okay, you're a dad too. You're not
Yeah, I'm
going
a
anywhere.
dad too. I can't go anywhere. Uh,
Awesome.
but yeah, so do you want to plug your book?
Sure. Well, anybody who's interested in some serious World War II historical fiction should read The Soul of a Thief, the first part of my World War II trilogy, and the second part, The Last of the Seven, and then be patient with me while I'm working on part three.
I have not read The Soul of the Thief, but I have read The Last of the Seven, and it has a very dynamic opening, and it is beautifully written because, of
Thank
course,
you.
Steve has established himself and is allowed to describe things, and he describes them beautifully. And so you will really get into it. It's great historical fiction, and as you know, he knows what it's like to jump out of a plane in World War II. So you've got the authenticity there.
Thank you, sir.
Anyway, thank you, Steve. Thank you for being on the Dad Lit Pod, and thanks everyone for listening.
Gather round, dads, it's time for a tale. Hand me a book and a warm pint of ale. Let's discuss writing and the literary gods with Dan Roberts on the Dad Lit Pod. Our time together has come to an end. It's time to return to your wife, kids, and friends. It's time to pick up those books you forgot while you wait for the next Dad Lit Pod.